Okay, I got 5 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's see. We left off. Gosh, I was looking at the schedule. There's like 2 weeks of class left after this one, right? Yes. Whenever the classes start, I make this joke to my supervisor that, like, the first week of class, I go, "Oh, fall term is 8% over," right? And so now we're like 28 out of 30 weeks, right? So we're like 90% done with the school year. Hard part's still ahead, though, right? That means this weekend I'm going to prioritize getting your worksheets back to you and getting a review sheet up so that we can talk about that on Monday for the final, right? And I have a pretty good idea about how far I can get in 4 more class sessions, right? I do want to devote part of one of the class sessions to going, like probably the last one before the paper is due, to going over sort of the things that you ought to include in the paper, right? And making sure that's all pretty clear for everybody, right? So that'll lead into how far we can progress into the 20th century. But we should certainly get there, at least, sort of set up the stage for that, which is better than I did last semester. So that's, good. Okay? So that's the long and the short of that. We'll have a discussion on Tuesday. The review sheet will look exactly like the midterm one did, only with different pictures on it, right? And yeah, there we are. Okay. We left off talking about realism, which is this movement from the mid-19th century and begins in France in 1848, no less, in response to a number of external issues. But basically, the long and the short of it is that artists begin to focus on contemporary life. And they're not really the same as Dutch genre scenes that we saw in the Renaissance and the Baroque period. They're kind of different than that. They're really sort of finding just mundane elements of everyday life. And when we use the term realism, what we're talking about are real events. Not even events is not the right word, right? Pictures of the real world, right? And it's not about being realistic, as we tend to use the term, right? Looking like a photograph. But rather it's about trying to find elements of everyday life. And we found that these artists, many of them, were very strongly politically motivated, that at least at first, the realists were trying very hard to enlighten people to the plight of the working class, that a lot of them were socialists, right, and very interested in sort of illuminating people in the cities to how tough people in the countryside have it. But eventually it spreads to the city as well. And we were looking at Manet as a prominent example of realism, but also one who focuses almost exclusively on urban scenes rather than farm labor, which is what we saw starting. So we were looking at the railway. We were talking about Manet's importance for the development of art. What we'll see is that the realist revolution, for lack of a better word, really did change art. They're not interested in history scenes. They're not interested in mythological scenes. They're not interested in biblical scenes. They're interested in today. And they're also kind of not interested in telling stories, right? They're just sort of snippets of things that might happen on any given day, like a nanny out with her, the young girl that she's in charge of, stopping for a spot of lunch, a little bit of grapes on it, and reading a book. That's the long and the short of it. And the child sort of enamored by the trains coming and going in the railway yard, which we don't get to see. They're just sort of back there. So it's a very sort of, there's nothing special about the scene, right? The only thing special about it is how Manet treats it. It's not a goddess or anything like that. It's just an everyday life. And by elevating that to art, he makes it something special. The other thing that's quite important about Manet, and that got him quite a bit of criticism, was the way in which he handles paint. And that Manet's work, and this is what we were talking about at the end of class, Manet's work makes you very aware of the artifice of a painting. right? In other words, it's not a photograph, right? That it's artificial, that is constructed by an artist. And by leaving the brushstrokes unblended and sketchy, what he ends up leaving are the traces of his activity, making the viewer very aware of two things. One, an artist constructed this, right? You know, there's always that magic with something like Van Eyck, where you think, oh my God, this is like beyond real, right? But with Manet, you realize that this was made by an artist as a process, right? So one hand is that. On the other hand, it also makes you very aware that you're not just looking through a window that extends our space, which ever since Brunelleschi invented one-point perspective, ever since Giotto got things three-dimensional in the 14th century, art has been, this viewing art has given us the sense that we're seeing an extension of the space that we inhabit, right? And that the two-dimensional surface of the painting is in fact a mirror or a window, right? And that the things that we're seeing are actually three-dimensional, right? And Manet keeps bringing you back, right? Back and forth between that. We look at it, we say, okay, I understand how the space is organized and all of that. But then your eye goes wang, and all of a sudden you realize it's paint on a canvas, right? And he got a lot of criticism for that, right? And very forward-looking. He's not the first to do it, but he's the first to do it without any kind of checks and balances. You know, other artists, and we've seen some of them, had sort of very obvious brushwork. Rembrandt, right? Velázquez. Manet loves Velázquez. There was a new gallery of Spanish painting in Paris. He adores Velázquez, right? Delacroix, we didn't really talk about this, but very much interested in that. Manet's sort of doing it, but more so, right? And the critics thought that he was making fun of the traditional way in which artists were taught to paint, right? The academic approach taught by the Academy, right? The Royal Academy, which was a sort of classical approach where you really work the paint and you blend the different elements to give you that sense, to go back to an old word, chiaroscuro, right? Manet's paint is, let's see if this is going to work or not. I'm trying to use, there we go. Manet's paint is laid on in layers that he builds up. Sometimes he leaves the texture underneath and drags color over the top of it. And it ends up, as we look at it, looking very, very abstract, as if he's not really trying to define form in some parts of it. And that what he's really interested in is how the colors play against each other, right? What he's really interested in is the evocation of an idea rather than the delineation of a hard-edged form, right? And this is one of the great things about Manet's work, is that tension. But like I said, he got in trouble for this, so to speak, right? His work was often criticized, and strongly, because of this loose approach to paint application, the sketchiness that he reveals. When we looked on Monday, we looked at Constable. We saw a huge 6-foot sketch of the White Horse. Well, that was a sketch, right? It was intended as a sketch. It was for Constable's own use. He's not putting it out there as a finished work of art, right? And he's in England. But beyond that, right, Manet is putting this forth as a finished work of art, and that at least to the French critics, throughout his career, which begins in the late 50s, his work remains to them sort of a poke in the eye, like he's making fun of them, right? And they don't like that. So he has a lifetime of difficulties. And some of these he made himself. So one of the most radical works that he had, that really was the focus of a major series of problems, was this image of Olympia from 10 years earlier. The model is, in fact, the exact same model in both works. It's Victorine Marant. She was a professional model, right? And Manet's favorite model. He used her often. And she was also a painter, right? Uh, there are no works that survive from her that we know of, but we have records that she was actually not bad, right, as a painter. Although we should remember that it was difficult for women to be painters because they didn't have the same opportunities that men did. And this is why we've seen so few, right? You think about this class, you could count them on one hand, right? The number of non-male artists we've looked at in this class. And that's not that they didn't have as much talent as that they didn't have as much opportunity, right? The doors to the academy were not open to them, okay? So Victorine Marant is his favorite model. And here in Olympia, he submits this to the Salon of 1865. Remember, the Salon is the biennial. I don't know why this is. I'll tell you, I was going to try and carry this around, and look what's happening. I'm going to stop this for a second. Hang on and figure out what the heck is going wrong here with my. Try this one more time here and see if I can bring it back. Is it going to come back? Looks like I'm not going to be able to carry it on my arm. We tried that once before, and I thought I had it fixed. So make sure I've still got the picture. Okay, very good. We're back in business, I think. We're back in business. It doesn't look like it. Hang on. Sorry about this, guys. I got to stop this because I did something wrong. So now your recording's going to look funny because you've got the background. So let me just pull this up again. Do this again. Make double sure that we're recording still. And get back to business. Okay. He submits this to the Salon of 1865, and there's a huge amount of sort of negative press toward it. And all of the issues that we're talking about with the railway, which is 10 years later, were also voiced against him here. People felt that he was mocking them. The critics, the Academy, because remember that the salons were supported by the French Royal Academy, right? And they were championing a particular, very studious way of approaching art, and Manet simply was not doing it. And they felt in particular that he was having a row, right? He was having a go at them. And they really didn't like it. And with the Olympia and some of earlier works by Manet, certain things came up that really miffed them. One of them was they're very reference heavy. Manet is very interested in earlier works of art, and he's trying to make modern versions of well-known Renaissance works. And part of that is trying to make something for the 19th century that would live on in the way that Titian lives on for the 16th century. Hopefully, in generations to come, people would look back at Olympia, he would hope, and would use that work to remember how great 19th century France was, in the same way that we look back at a Titian Venus and think about how great Venice was in the 16th century, right? That's in his mind. It's meant as a conscious homage to Titian. But this is not how it was received. It was received as a great big joke. He must be pulling our leg, right? And was criticized for that. Now, part of and by the way, the idea is pulling his leg. I love how he takes a little puppy dog and translated it into this angry little kitten, right, at the feet of the figure. And that's sort of little details like that made people upset. The other thing that made them upset was, and you can see, I don't have to point out exactly how close this is. Not only is it the reclining figure, placement of the hands, all of that, but even the blocking of the background, right, with the green curtain pulled back on the left. And instead of opening up to deeper space, Titian, where we see the nude figure's assistance, she's now brought closer, right? And instead of being in some sort of faraway place, she's a maid, right? and directly up in her face, and kind of flattened out as well, the entire composition, not deep, right? Deep in space. And even the way the white drapery, right? I mean, it's just so many things you look at are not just by chance that the white sheet lifts up in exactly the same place and reveals a red bed cushion underneath, right? So Manet is definitely sort of doing a modern Titian. And what miffed people was this idea that he's mocking the old masters, because they felt that since his technique was so sketchy as to be mocking what the Academy taught, he's also sort of, having fun with the old masters, the Renaissance, right? And they didn't see it the way he intended it, which was a serious homage and an updating of taking what Titian meant to the 16th century, trying to say that there's something similar here. Now, another thing that became interesting for Manet and his reception by the critics is wrapped up in the title of Titian's work, The Venus of Urbino. This is not Venus. This was a painting that was commissioned for a bachelor party, right? For the wedding of the son of the Duke of Urbino in the 16th century. And she is a courtesan. She's a prostitute. Venus of Urbino is. But over the years, right, so it really would be just a portrait of a courtesan, right? And there are no attributes that say that this is Venus, right? There's no mirror, there's no Cupid, even though Titian had made things like that, right? And we've seen some of them, yeah? There's just the flowers, right? And some her hair done nicely, and she looks out at us coyly. She's a courtesan. But through the years, in referring to this picture, this nickname grew up around it, so that by Manet's time, it was known as the Venus of Urbino. Because then we make it safe to look at. You know what I mean? If it's Venus and it's a goddess, she's supposed to be naked. And it's not meant to be sort of an in-your-face eroticism. Okay? But if she's just a courtesan, then it's a really naughty picture. In fact, Mark Twain, when he saw this thing, went to Italy, saw it, he said, it is the rudest picture ever made. Like, he saw right through it. And part of what he was commenting on is what she's doing with her hand, right? The curling of her fingers, right? Do I need to say the word, the M word, right? In any event, Manet also understands what the picture really was and gives us a modern version, because Olympia was a common stage name, quote unquote, used by prostitutes in 19th century France. And it came out of a realist novel. Realism as a movement was not limited to painting. And there was a novel that talked about the life of a prostitute in Paris, right? Kind of went into what it was like to be a prostitute, to be a member of that working class. And the protagonist in the novel was named Olympia. And that led a number of prostitutes in France, in Paris, to sort of use the name Olympia. And so by calling it Olympia, what Manet is telling us directly that this ain't no Venus, right? This is a prostitute. And he's also reminding us that Titian, that he was borrowed from, was as well. And the critics just did not like that reminder of a sort of coarser background to what is coming forth as high art, right? It's a low subject matter. And with both of the pictures, the fascinating thing about it, and I think this doubled Manet's problems, is who's brought the flowers to her? Nobody in the picture, right? Titian puts a couple of people in the background. They're getting clothes for her or putting her clothes away. It's hard to say, right? Who's brought those flowers? You have, right? And keep in mind, a room that's 2/3 ladies, right? That in this 19th century, this is a very patriarchal society. Our critics are all men. They're being basically said, this is what it's like to visit a prostitute. And most of them probably had at some point, was part of the culture in the 19th century, but no one wants to be reminded of it, right? So all of this just adds to Manet's problems that he's having through the course of his career, is this sense that he's really picking at the critics one way or another, right? Either through mocking academic traditions, either through seeming to make fun of the old masters, or whether to implicate them in an unseemly activity that's sort of winked at but not acknowledged, right? All this has got Manet in a ton of trouble. Now you'll notice, I'm going to go back a slide just briefly, a couple of slides here, let's go back. How Manet loves the direct encounter. All of his pictures are really fascinating in this sort of psychology with which they address you, right? You become more aware that you're looking at this because she's looking back at you. And in all of them, Manet pictures, when somebody makes facial recognition with us, there's no sense of recognition. There's no sense of familiarity. There's no sense of anything other than anonymity, which I think is one of the most fascinating things about Manet's pictures, is the degree to which they dialogue with us, but we don't know them. In the railway, we're like that guy who bothers women at bars reading books. You know, you can't go out and have a cup of coffee and there's some guy going to, hey, what you reading? Right? Sense. And she gives us that look, which is like, really? Do I have to go through this? You know, so she's holding the place in her book because she knows this guy's not going to go away, right? And with Olympia, it's like, oh, great, flowers, you know, like I've never seen that before. There's this sort of matter-of-fact expressionlessness in his pictures that make them really fascinating and really sort of engaging, because you want to find something more going on. And just look at her facial features compared to Titian's to get a sense of what I'm talking about here. The other work that was painted the same year as the Olympia, and both of these are fairly large, like 5 or 6 feet across, was the famous Luncheon on the Grass. And where the Olympia he held on to for 2 years, he didn't exhibit it in the Salon until 1865. The Luncheon on the Grass went into the Salon in 1863, right? Submitted it that year as one of his official submissions to this. Remember, it's sometimes annual, but mostly biennial. So these were subsequent Salon pictures. And again, he shows us not only his flashy, sketchy brush work that we see everywhere, and that's true for the Olympia too, but also we've got another naked woman looking at us, right? Directly at us, and again with no sort of expression. And there's these two guys, they're having lunch, and they're not even looking at her. They're sort of talking about politics. Who knows, right? They're engaged in some sort of deep conversation with each other, and she's just there sort of, hey, they're ignoring me. What are you up to, right? She's looking out at us. And the fact that she's naked, right, is emphasized because her clothes are there, right? There's a big pile of her clothes. So you become aware not only that she's naked, but also you become very aware that she maybe should have clothes on, and there's something sort of naughty about all of this, right? Seeing them, there's something naughty about them. He doesn't explain, maybe she's been bathing, there's a woman in the water in the background. Notice how the perspective doesn't work. She's way too big. That again makes the canvas seem flatter, right? You become aware less of a window and more of an object, right? A surface with color. There's a boat behind her as well, and again the perspective does, the boat's way too small for her, right? But the clothes in the foreground just remind us that, you know, Venus never really wears clothes, right? Goddesses don't have to. They belong that way. That's their natural state, right? They're nude rather than naked. Think back to Donatello's David versus Michelangelo's David. Donatello's David's got booties on and a hat, right? Michelangelo's David he's nude. It's like there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way he's supposed to be. There's no sign that he ever should wear clothes. Well, with Manet, he keeps reminding us this is a naked woman, right? This is somebody you can see on the street, right? But she's in the park and uh, nude, or kind of rudely naked. There's a close-up of her as well. Again, people criticize it. Some of the critiques I mentioned before. I see skin but no bones, someone said. I can't find knuckles in her hand. These were the sorts of things that people were really sort of concerned with when they looked at her. It's his favorite model again. It's Victorine Meurent. We're now pretty sure that it's only her face, and that someone else modeled for the body simply because she doesn't look like the Olympia, and it's painted in the exact same year. Olympia's much thinner than this particular model is, but still it is Victorine's face on it as well, as she looks directly out at us. Titian is again, and this is part of the criticism, doing homage to great masters of the past, and Manet is, and Titian is certainly the man he's been looking at. And so if we look at our Luncheon on the Grass and we think back to the Pastoral Symphony that we discussed at some length many weeks ago, you can see that it's kind of the same idea. We've got two guys engaged with each other, one talking, one listening, right? With inexplicably nude women with them, right? And for for Titian, she was the muse, right? She was the inspiration. She holds a flute that inspires the song that the lute player strums and the shepherd listens. Manet takes this idea and simply updates it to the 19th century. And there's something about the loss of a sense of safe distance, the distance of centuries, the distance of cultures, the distance of gods versus humans. Once you collapse that, the picture becomes more problematic. It's much more confrontational, right? And people again thought he's just making fun. The Pastoral Symphony hangs in the Louvre, right? He knew this work directly because it's in the museum. He can just go see it every Sunday if he wants to, right? But he's changed it so radically in giving her a set of clothes that she could be wearing. And like I said, Titian is often very reference heavy. The actual positioning of the three figures at the center of the composition by the side of a river comes out of a print after Raphael. This Marc Antonio Raimondi print was based on a design that Raphael had made and provided to the engraver Marc Antonio to make reproductive prints after. Another work that Manet certainly knew and borrows. Where here, right, so here's the Judgment of Paris scene. We've seen that a couple times over, right? And on the right, some sea gods hanging out. Now, it's okay for gods to be naked. There is nothing wrong with that in anybody's mind in the 19th century. The problem for a realist artist who's not painting a mythology, not painting history, and not painting a narrative, the problem for that artist is that the safety of distance is gone. And Manet got nailed by the critics for this. And they added to it everything else he was doing. His approach to handling paint became part of that same critique. Now, he submits this to the Salon of 1863, like I said. And in fact, it was rejected. Right? When the critics saw this, they said, I'm sorry, this is just too much. We do not want this in the Salon. And it turns out that year, 1863, the critics actually rejected quite a few works, because Manet's not the only one who's getting a little bit more daring in his approach to art, a little bit more individualized in his approach to art. And there were something like 5,000 submissions to the 1863 Salon. And the jury rejected over half of them. And the artists got kind of angry. This is crazy. You've never rejected this many works before. And so what the jury decided to do, the Royal Academy jury, was to mount a second exhibition to show everybody the works that they had rejected, right? And it was across town. It was called the Salon of the Refused Works, the Salon des Refusés, right? And the point on the point of the critics was to shut everybody up. Fine, we'll let you be seen in public. And I think they also wanted to prove to the public that those works sucked, right? That the ones that were in the real salon were, in fact, significantly better. That's what he's hoping, right? And as you might imagine, more people go to the salon of the refused works than go to the other salon because people want to see scandal, right? And at the center of that secondary show, the one work that everybody was talking about was the luncheon on the grass. And people were thronging it, pushing their way through the entire show just to see it. Because they heard all about it, and now they got to go, oh my God, for themselves, right? As to the craziness that they're seeing. One last detail from this, and then we'll move on. Just so we can see that already in 1863, Manet has hit upon this sort of patchwork style, right? Where the paint is laid down in a series of what the critics called patches, right? Individual strokes of paint. So those apples and oranges and cherries in the upended basket, spilling out, very sort of sensual, right? Fruit spilling out of a basket, are rendered in a way that doesn't make any attempt whatsoever to sort of resolve things. It ends up looking as if it's spontaneously painted. And it's worth remembering that it isn't, right? That it's not quickly done. He just wants it to look that way. And part of that is to make it modern, to make it contemporary. Now, realism as a movement really morphs without any kind of distinction into Impressionism. We've all probably heard of the Impressionists. You often get Impressionist calendars at the gift shop, Monet coffee mugs, right? It's one of those things where you probably have heard of the art movement before you got here to this particular class. It grew directly out of realism. It shares the same interests. Real scenes of real world, right? A contemporary event. No narrative scenes, no biblical scenes, no historical stories to tell, no exemplum virtutis images, right? It is basically a straightforward illustration of the modern world. And Monet stands more or less at the center of this new movement, right? So on the right, Impression Sunrise is the harbor where the Seine River, after it leaves Paris, flows toward the North Sea. And this is in the town of Le Havre. Don't bother to write that down if you don't want to. But it's right where the Seine empties out into the North Sea. And it's, as you look through the morning fog, you can see that this is an industrial harbor on the right. You can see cranes, you can see smokestacks belching coal smoke, adding to this wonderful color that comes out at sunrise. This is a polluted industrial harbor, and Monet uses it to capture these amazing colors at this moment in the morning, while a small fishing boat goes out to sea or comes back, right? On the left, he focuses on a brand new bridge in this distant suburb of Paris. Argenteuil is up the Seine from Paris, right? A little bit closer to the ocean. These days, it's been swallowed by Paris, right? You can take the RER to Argenteuil. I was in France last summer, and we were trying to get sort of past Argenteuil to a little place we had a little bit further out, where we were going to spend the night before we went to the airport, right? And just to get by car from Paris there was like driving 270 at 4:30 in the afternoon. It just snarled with traffic the entire way. So now it's really part of Paris. But at the time, it was a distant suburb. People usually didn't live there and go into the city. But the highway bridge, the road bridge that you see here, helped facilitate that traffic back and forth, right? So what we see is, with both of these pictures, an interest in modern France, right? Industrial harbor, brand new road bridge, right? These are very, very modern images of the benefits of industry, one could argue. And again, we talked about this with Manet, about the idea that France in the 1870s is rebuilding after the Franco-Prussian War. And these images suggest that maybe there's a positive way of viewing industry rather than the negative way it was seen during the Romantic era, earlier in the 19th century. Right? Argenteuil was a place where the Seine as a river got a little bit wider as it sort of snakes its way out of Paris. And it was a very, very popular weekend destination for Parisians because of the nice, gentle current there. This happens when a river gets wider. And it was, in fact, a very popular sailing spot. And Monet captures this. Right? So Impressionism grew directly from realism. And many of the artists who were Impressionists got their start in the realist camp, right? And some of them still called themselves realists. But they share the same interests. Now, there are some things that are different about the Impressionists. And there are some things that are worthwhile sort of discussing as we talk about what makes Impressionism Impressionism. First, the name Impressionism was given to a group of 30 painters at their initial show in 1874. There was a group of 30 painters who got together. Many of them had been rejected by the Salon on one too many occasions. And they want to have shows that they themselves curate, that they themselves jury, where they don't have to worry about the old school, closed-minded academy jurors. Right? So they're going to have an independent show. This is, in fact, I should have said this before, right? This is part of the reason Manet is such an important figure, why the 1863 Salon is so important, right? Because it helped to inspire people to think there are other ways to get our work seen than going through the traditional academy. Okay? And having the Salon of the Refused Work suggested that you can get your work out there without going through these closed-minded jurists, these closed-minded curators of the Royal Academy show. So this is another reason why this is such an important moment, 1863. And when we get to the Impressionists, right, we end up with a group of artists who got together, 30-ish of them. And their original name was just the Society of Independent Artists. That's what they're going to call themselves. And they're going to have their own show, right? And in fact, they mean this as rebellion because they decide to stage their show 2 weeks before the Salon opens, right? So we're undercutting it. We're not going to wait to get rejected, right? We're going to be out there in front, right? So they form at the end of 1873. They have their very first show in 1874. There are 8 total Impressionist shows from 1874 to 1886. So there isn't one every single year, right? Like the second one is 1877, I think. Okay? But scattered over the course of 12 years, there are these 8 shows of a group of artists, the Society of Independent Artists, right? The title Impressionism came from that picture on the right. When the first show went up, critics showed up to write about it, and they wrote that it stunk. They did not like it at all. They said, these pictures all look unfinished. These pictures look like nothing more than impressions. Now, if we think about what the word impression means, right, insofar as looking and understanding, it's something that's quick, right? the old adage, the old saying, never trust your first impressions. Because an impression is a momentary reaction, right? Rather than a studied, thoughtful conclusion, right? And they said the paintings are all impressions. In other words, they're just nothing but the initial start of something, rather than what art should be, which is thoughtful conclusions, right? They look like nothing more than impressions, and coined the term Impressionism for the entire group. And the name stuck, but it was initially intended as a criticism, right? As a put down. And it was all based on Monet's Impression Sunrise. So from this point forward, they have 7 more shows over the next 12 years. They like the name Impressionism. They say, yeah, that kind of fits some of the things we're trying to do. And they end up co-opting the name for themselves. Right? Punk rock kind of had the same thing, right? When the Ramones first got out there, people, what a bunch of punks. Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what we are, right? And the name sort of stuck. So it's one of those things where the criticism ended up coming back to sort of bite the critic, if you will. Right? I want to talk about a few issues regarding Impressionism that are worthwhile clarifying, okay? First thing, you often will find Manet listed as an Impressionist. He was not. The Impressionists were a group, right? They invited him to join. When they got together in 1873 to think about this whole idea of an independent group, right? Who better to ask than Manet, who had had nothing but problems with the Academy, right? Over the last decade. He should be the one that they invited. He's friends with everybody. He knows Monet, right? There's paintings of Monet by Manet and vice versa, right? They're friends. And they say, hey, Ed, join us. You're a perfect fit. And Manet said no. He said, I don't want to. I want to work with the Salon. I want my stuff to be accepted. You know, and that's part of his thing. He thinks that he needs to convince them, right? Rather than just run away. So if you ever read in a book or anywhere else that Manet is an Impressionist, you can say, no, he's not. That was a group, and he wasn't part of it, right? The interesting thing about the Railway is that when the first Impressionist show opened, 1874, in April, right? Manet submitted this to the Salon that same year. And so the year that the Impressionists have their first show, the Railway is hanging in the Salon of 1874, right? It's part of the traditional academic show, still being criticized, right? So Manet, friends with everybody, he had a little bit more money than many of the rest of them did. He often bought dinner, right? Picked up the tab because he came from a fairly wealthy family, and that's probably why he wanted to work with the Salon still. Second thing, so Manet, no Impressionism, right? Second thing, it was an evolving group. It started off being a group of 30 painters who got together to make independent shows. Not one of the 30, not one of them, was in all 8 shows. Every time the independent artists got together to mount another show, the lineup was different, right? It wasn't like joining a different kind of club where you would have a club membership card and you'd come back year in and year out. So every year there's a sort of different group of people. Some drop out, some join in. You might drop out for one and come back for another, right? There isn't a strict lineup, okay? Not even Monet was in all 8. There was a couple of Impressionist shows with no Monets, which is hard to imagine, right? Third thing, there is no single style for Impressionism. When we talk about Impressionism, we usually talk about Monet. We talk about broken brushwork, right? We talk about an interest in light. But not every impressionist painted in that way. There were others that painted even more academically, that were part of the show, that just wanted to be independent from the salon. That may well have had their works accepted if they submitted them, but they wanted to be part of this new modern group, right? So Impressionism is not what the calendars tell you, right? It's not only people who paint like Monet. Manet was never part of the group, right? And the group isn't really a group in that it changes and fluctuates year in and year out. Now, what can we say about them? What do they have in common? As exemplified by Monet. First and foremost, they're working outside. They're getting the majority of the work done on their canvas, painting in the out of doors. The French word for this is en plein air, in full light, in the great outdoors. En plein air painting. Now, prior to the Impressionists, this was impossible. Prior to the Impressionists, artists ground the paints they were going to use day by day, and the leftover might go into a little bit of sausage casing, pig's bladder was what they often used to store things in, right? So a little bit of a little leather sack made from intestines, right? 1840s, somebody invents little tin tubes with little tin caps that screw on them. Modern tubed paint, 1840s. And Renoir, one of the most famous impressionists, said, without tubed paint, we would never exist. Right? Because what it allowed you to do is to go outside with a paint box full of an entire range of colors. Right? Not just 2 or 3 that you might put in a backpack. You could have your entire chromatic range with you, and it's not going to dry out, and you put a little bit on your palette, right, and you can work outside. So painting outdoors is something that almost all of the Impressionists did, right? Paint directly on the canvas. Also separates Manet. Manet never painted outside. Manet painted exclusively in the studio, right? So en plein air is one thing that holds the group together, right? The majority of them paint en plein air. And it's one of the great innovations of the Impressionists, is this focus on painting outside. Now these days we just take it for granted. We do it, right? People in art classes will do it, paint outside. But it was kind of unheard of when the Impressionists started doing this. And by the way, they started well before they formed as a group, right? They started back in the 1860s doing this. The second thing that they share is an extremely sketchy and loose application of paint. Nice close-up of the little rowboat with a couple in it behind our central boat in Monet's picture, where we can see the degree to which the paint is laid down without attempt to blend it. There are sections that are green, there are sections that are pink, there are sections that are blue and brown and yellow. But there's no blending between them. You become very aware, as you did with Manet, of the way in which Monet applies the paint to the canvas. It looks spontaneous. It looks sketchy, right? We tend to use the word sketchy differently these days, right? Not that way. It's not nasty or dubious. It's as if it were a sketch rather than a finished work. Now, this sketchiness that we see, this spontaneity that appears in Monet's work, is in fact itself a little artificial. Monet's works are the result of many, many, many hours of work. And we know this from looking at the surface of the paint, that he works it and works it and works it, and he does a lot of it outside, but he continues to work on it back in the studio. And so if you look at areas like just beneath this halyard, the line that we see here, if we look at areas like right in, from the side I can see that, right in here, You can see there's a series of a layer of paint down below where the strokes sort of go this way. And it's made sort of three major ridges coming down. And then he's come across it with more paint this way. And this is true throughout his works, that we can see that he lays some paint down and lets it dry. Right? You can't get that effect unless the paint has time to dry. And then you come back over the top of it with something else. This cannot be spontaneous. He wants it instead to simply look spontaneous. Right? He wants it to give the impression of being an impression. Right? He wants it to seem as if this is a fleeting moment in time that he was lucky enough to capture. Another nice detail of the reflection in the foreground, right, where we can see how he's laid down all of these different areas of paint. Right? Why is Monet painting this way? Why does he want it to look spontaneous when in fact it isn't? This goes to sort of the third big thing for the Impressionists. As a group, the majority of the Impressionists are very much interested in the changing effects of light. They want to use their paintings to talk about how light is color and how the world around us is, our perception of the world around us is our perception of different patterns of light. And that these patterns of light change moment by moment by moment. That if you start a canvas at noon, if you're still working on it at 2 o'clock, the light is going to be different. And so what Monet wants to get across is the idea that somehow he could get it instantaneously. Right? He can capture the light of a particular moment. And as we look across the canvas, everywhere we look, we see light flickering everywhere, coming off of the water, up onto the bridge. Monet had moved to this distant suburb. He lived here in Argenteuil, would take the train back into Paris to sell his pictures through his dealer. But he chooses to live here because the light is so fantastic at this wide part of the river. Right? And he's focusing on how light flickers and filters through everything. So the open brushwork that Monet uses is meant to emphasize the fact that the quality of light that we see in this particular picture is a changing quality of light. That the subject matter that he chooses, the road bridge in Argenteuil, is on a certain level less important to him than the light that plays off of that road bridge. And as we look at the pillars, for example, we can see how much he gets the light coming up from the water, right? Illuminating not only the stone piers of the bridge, but up underneath the cornice where the deck of the road is, you can see how it's also altering the color of the stone, right? We get greens and yellows and blues up there against the gray cement, right? Light is everywhere. Light is color. So the sketchiness of his brushwork enhances this idea. I love those people up top on the bridge, right? This is a road bridge. It's a utilitarian structure, but it's new, right? For Paris or for France, it's a new thing. And you get the sense that, oh, wow, this is a view I've never had before. Let's go on the bridge and take a look up the river and see what we can see. And there's taking advantage of this new industrial transportation structure for something much more charming and relaxing, right? Downtime. With the idea that Monet is just as interested in the color of light as the subject matter that he chooses, and I don't think the subject matter is backdoor to him at all, right? I think this is all part of the progress of France, the rebuilding of France that we talked about. But if he's interested in how light plays on it, then he can't just paint it once, right? He's going to have to do it multiple times. And almost all of our Impressionist artists, the ones that really focus on the quality of light, will take the same subject matter and paint it again and again and again and again. And the point is that each time you paint it, you're going to, because you're painting outside, right? Each time that you paint it, you're going to see something different because the light is going to be different based on the weather, based on the time of day, based on the season of the year. Right? All of these things are going to change the way in which that bridge looks. So in this case, he's standing at the far end. He's on the opposite shore here, right? And he's on the opposite side of the bridge looking back, right? So he's kind of where we can't see in the National Gallery picture in this one from Richmond, looking back across. And you can see it's slightly more realistic in the colors, a little bit less, but at the same time, it's cloudier, right? He wants to capture what the light looks like, what the color looks like at that point. Back in the National Gallery, a third picture in a local collection of exactly this same spot, and all from the same time. This is where he lives. He goes out and sketches them. And you can see as we look at these that they are in different levels of resolution. This one on the left, very, very sketchy still. Arguably very early, not as polished as the one we started with. But we're again sort of at the same spot. We're looking down the bridge. There's a floating dock there that he omitted from the first picture that we had. But here's our basin with the boats. And beyond the bridge, we can see the actual railway bridge as well. Right? So he does multiples of the same subject matter. He does this throughout his entire career. And the reason is that the bridge is not necessarily what he's most interested in. He's interested in it, but he's not most interested in it. What he is most interested in is how light plays off that bridge at different times of day, under different weather patterns, at different times of the year. And you can't capture that unless you do these in multiples. And at the Impressionist show, he would often hang anywhere between 6 and a dozen of these, side by side by side by side. And the impression would be, right, the effect would be, you stop looking at the subject matter and you start looking at the differences between them, right? So Monet is one of the group. Now, there's no real leader of the Impressionists, even though he's the most famous of the group. Is Monet. They came from a range of ages, from very young to the next generation older, but there was no real central leader, right? They were a collective, a group of artists who wanted to work together in order to do an end run around the Academy jury that was rejecting them so very often. The oldest member of the group was Camille Pissarro. Ended up teaching quite a few of the younger artists over the years. And in this case, we see a scene of rural France. In fact, just outside of Paris. We know where he was living, and it's a little sort of distant suburb that's a bit more rural than Argenteuil was. And he depicts for us in a very impressionistic manner, right? Broken brushworks, interest in light at a particular time of year, but also very much an interest in this realist idea of rural, non-urban life. So when we looked at the realists, we saw them starting off making images of labor, right? Images of labor where people are working hard and not profiting. Pissarro never shows us that. Even when people work in a Pissarro picture, it doesn't look like it's all that difficult. And for Pissarro, rural life was an ideal, something to aspire toward, a refuge from life in the city. And so he shows us these two villagers, a woman going off to market behind them on the path. But there's no work going on. They're just chatting across the fence in the middle of the day. This is meant to show us the degree to which this kind of image is, this kind of life is a superior way to live than modern industrial city. Exactly, like the adoration and other things more recent, right? So yes, we talked about this idea of a pastoral scene, right? we talked about it going back to Giorgione, right? Um, but even more recently, we can think about Constable, right, with the red horse, showing us rural life as this idealized thing. Constable's picture, the red horse, was actually shown in Paris at the Salon, so a lot of artists had the opportunity to see it. And certainly when we think of Millet, uh, the gleaners, and we also saw some potato gatherers, there's the sense that for many people, as Europe industrializes, the rural countryside becomes a sort of mythic idea in their mind, right, of a place to escape to. Pissarro paints almost exclusively these kinds of images, especially early in his career here, early in his Impressionist career. The town he's living in is Louveciennes. It's not far from Argenteuil. And here we see they're gathering sticks around these orchards in bloom. And yes, there's some work going on. The man on the right has a sack over his shoulder. The one on the left bowing over to gather sticks. But there's not a sense that it's horrifying and demeaning, dehumanizing, sweaty toil, right? These are people who are engaged with the land. And that's really what Pissarro focuses on. Another famous Impressionist was Edgar Degas. Let me catch up with my notes here, make sure I'm not forgetting something. Degas was one of the founding members, so was Pissarro, part of that original group of 30 that got together in 1873 to show their works in 1874. When the critic called them Impressionists, Degas said, "That's not for me." He did not like the term at all. He said that his job as a painter, the labels that he liked for himself as a painter, was a realist, going back to the realist agenda of painting the working class. That's what he felt was the best label for him and his works. And so he paints for us quite a few scenes of dancers. And with that in mind, two things. First, other Impressionists are doing multiple images, right? Monet did all of those bridges in Argenteuil. Degas also likes the idea of multiple images because then you start to look at things other than the subject matter. You start to look at the composition. You start to look at maybe the play of light in the interior. You start to look at the handling of paint. But also, with doing multiples of ballet dancers, Degas wants us also to focus on this because it is indeed work, right? We don't think of performance, the arts, as work, but indeed they are. And in the 19th century, ballet dancers were not prima donnas. Ballet dancers were not esteemed, right? They were not high-class women, or seen in the way of Misty Copeland, right, is all over everything these days, as the first dancer for the New York Ballet, right? And there's prestige that comes with that. But in the 19th century, they were called theater rats. They were the lowest of the low. They were usually daughters of very, very poor people who were brought to the theater and then supported there through sort of rich sugar daddies who would give them money for dancing, but they were not esteemed. The esteemed performers were the singers, right, were the actors, but the ballet dancers were not, right? So Degas' works fall into this realist idea of lower class labor. And we have to remind ourselves of that looking back now from the 21st century, that ballerinas had a very different status. Degas spends quite a bit of time, and often in multiples, with images of women at work. Does a whole series of images of washer women, women who wash and iron clothes, who work for the benefit of someone else. We could argue the same thing is true with a ballet dancer. They are performing for someone else's benefit. and often not paid well for that. Right? In this case, the woman is cleaning and ironing clothes that are not her own. Right? She will then deliver them to someone, and is back-breaking work, being a laundress in the 19th century. Right? Degas loves images of labor, and that's what he focuses on through most of his career. There are some things that are quite impressionist about these. Certainly his handling of paint falls into that sketchy, spontaneous seeming application of paint, which very much like Monet is the result of quite a bit of work to get to look spontaneous. He's also, as you can see in this image, very much interested in how light filters through that room, like the play of light as a theme for him, how it works its way through the taffeta of her tutu, right? Plays off of the satin ribbons, shades certain parts, illuminating others. As we look deeper, we can see how the light folds around the figures, casts a shadow, and then obliterates that shadow as it moves through. So as we look again and again, we see sort of broken brush work, and an interest in the play of light everywhere we look. These associate him with his colleagues in the Impressionists, but like I said, he's very much interested in images of labor, images of work. He has other ways to make the image seem spontaneous. And Monet did this too, but Degas to a much greater extreme. Look at how the image is cropped. Look at how it's framed, right? It looks as if he didn't choose this view, as if he sort of happened on it. And you'll notice if you look at that spiral staircase that comes down the left side, it's kind of awkward, jammed up against the left frame. And also, it obliterates things in the composition. So we get this series of shins coming down the stairs, right? Not attached to anything up above. And as we work our way around the spiral staircase, we see all sorts of legs coming out. In fact, far too many for there to be people back there. Right? There's a leg here, a leg there, one coming down here. That's from her. But there's a pair here. Is that her head? There's just her legs popping out everywhere. And they're blocked by this. Now, this is all by choice. But what Degas is trying to do is to make it look as if it's a random scene, rather than one that was thoughtfully composed. He wants it to seem instantaneous. Right? By this time, by the 1870s, 1880s, cameras are getting smaller, getting to the point where you can actually have handheld cameras and get photos where I leave a mod out of half of it and I get half your face on it, you know? They're kind of emulating that idea, right? By breaking off. But at the same time, it adds to this impressionist interest in spontaneity, in the fact that what we're seeing here will be different in a few minutes. That's what Monet was trying to get across as well, right? The light will be different, the movement will be different. And this is why he paints them so many different times. Now, this blocking that he does, this sort of strange placement of a foreground silhouetted figure that's relatively flat and obscures the view of some of the things he seems to be trying to show us, is an effect that he got by looking at Japanese art. A wonderful woodcut by Hiroshige. These were coming into Paris with great frequency, and Degas was a collector of these whenever he would find them. And interestingly enough, a lot of them were making their way in as carton fillers, just crumbled up as padding inside carts, and he would find them on the docks and bring them home and collect them. And you can see here the degree to which Hiroshige is blocking the scene, right? He gives us the scene of a harbor with people moving past him, and then he throws up that red gate, and it just gets right in the way. And Degas responds to these. Right? And this brings up, we'll look at this and we'll sort of look at one more
It brings up a big issue for 19th century French art, beginning with the realists and sort of moving here into the impressionists. And that's a real great desire, think about Manet, to do something different, to do something new, right? To break with tradition. And it's what got Manet in trouble, was breaking with tradition so radically, right? They didn't like it. He got rejected from the salon on a regular basis because he was too radical, he was too new. But there is an interest, it seems, to begin to make paintings that are untraditional. And I think there's kind of a cause and effect here, even though we should always be wary of cause and effect things, right? The cause and effect is that the Industrial Revolution, right, late 18th, early 19th century, radically changed the way the world looked. Nowhere more so than Paris. We talked about that, right? Paris had the huge rebuilding under Haussmann, right? Then it was destroyed during the Franco-Prussian War, and the Commune, and was being rebuilt. And the Paris of 1870 didn't look like the Paris that anybody living then had grown up with. It just looked different. And there was this sense that the world that they lived in, both the construction around them, the buildings that surrounded them, but also how life is conducted, had changed drastically, right? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, if you went to work, you went to work for your family. You worked in a cottage industry. You made things by hand. After the Industrial Revolution, you work in a factory, right? You clock hours. That didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. And you work, you make something that makes someone else some money, right? All of this has changed drastically. The modern world to a 19th century Frenchman was different. It was modern. It was new, right? Why then should artists make traditional art forms? Why should we do the same thing that they were doing prior to the Industrial Revolution? Right? Now, no one comes out and actually articulates this, but we do have a lot of interest, beginning with realism, of modern art for the modern world. What's going on today? Why paint Roman history when I can paint contemporary France? It's just as great, right? So this deep-seated interest in upturning history, in rebelling against tradition, led artists to try to find examples that they could use to help them break free, right? Because the legacy of the Renaissance is so strong. The legacy of perspective, right? The window on the wall that extends. That is such a strong and long tradition that is very difficult to sort of see your way out of it. And they associate that with pre-industrial revolution. So with Manet, it's this idea of opening up the brushwork, looking back and maybe finding 2 or 3 guys that give you some clues about how to do something radically different. For Degas, and for a lot of artists from this time, non-Western art, right? Art produced by other cultures became an inspiration on how to make a painting, how to make an illustration that's still realistic, still looks like something, but doesn't follow the rules that have been set down ever since the 14th century. Right? And if you look at Hiroshige, you'll notice the degree to which a lot of stuff is flat. It's not modeled at all. That gate looks three-dimensional only because of that round line of the post and how it meets the crossbar. But there's no shading to it. It is just red. There's little or no draftsmanship to the rocks in the foreground that make up the pier. The water is one field of blue, right? All of that flattens it out. That's part of the charm of these things. And Manet, Degas are looking at these things. They're like, there's a way out. I've figured out how I can get out of the Western tradition, right? And they became a real fertile place. Some of them will make copies, direct copies of these compositions, but oftentimes they'll do what Raz doing here, realizing that with this innovative blocking of the thing that you're trying to show, right, you can do something that nobody really thought of before, that breaks the rules of composition, right? And in order to do that, in order to have that freedom, they had to be independent, right? They couldn't do this within the structure of the canon. This is why the Impressionists are so important as a movement when it comes to art sort of being more and more radical, right? Less and less traditional. So we're really standing at a kind of an important moment here at the end of the 19th century France, where instead of, we started the class off with art always being paid for by a patron who gets to determine a lot of what's going on, right? Giotto working for Scrovegni, right? Jan van Eyck working for Arnolfini. We have the Medici, right? People get to tell the artists what to do. Okay? And that idea continues when you have a system that juries your works into a show. You can then try to please the jury, get into the show, get well written up because you're easy and safe, or you can do something different. And it's not until artists like the Impressionists broke free, right, that we can actually talk about art becoming truly modern art in a way. Right? Okay, I got one more to God to show you, and then we'll wrap up Impressionism and move on from there. Yeah, so look, this weekend I'll be working on worksheets and a study sheet.